In the humid, salt-cracked air of the South Pacific in 1943, the most dangerous weapon in the United States Navy wasn't a 16-inch gun or a squadron of Hellcats. It was plywood, gray paint, and a massive amount of imagination. The carrier that wasn't there was born from a desperate necessity. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was stretched thin, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, was obsessively hunting the remaining American flat tops. To win the next encounter, the Americans decided to give the Japanese exactly what they wanted to see, a target too juicy to ignore. The construction of the Phantom naval forces began in the secluded coves of the Solomon Islands. While the real task forces were refueling hundreds of miles away, a ghost fleet was being hammered together by Seabees and camouflage engineers. They weren't building ships, they were building silhouettes. Using discarded timber, palm fronds, and thousands of yards of painted canvas, they constructed stage-set carriers. From a distance of 5 miles, or from the cockpit of a high-altitude Japanese reconnaissance plane, these structures mimicked the unmistakable long, flat profiles of an Essex-class carrier. These decoys were mounted on top of old barges or small, motorized patrol boats that were hidden beneath the flight deck. To complete the illusion, the engineers didn't just worry about the shape, they worried about the life of a ship. They installed smoke generators in the faux funnels to emit the dark, heavy burps of oil-burning boilers. They placed dummy wooden aircraft on the decks, arranged in the haphazard patterns of a busy flight deck mid-operation. The psychological brilliance of the decoy fleet lay in its placement. The Americans positioned these phantoms near leaky sectors, areas where they knew Japanese submarine scouts or long-range Mavis flying boats frequently patrolled. They wanted these ghosts to be found. They weren't hiding, they were performing. However, a ship that doesn't move is eventually recognized as a fraud. To solve this, the Americans employed tugboat tactics. Small, powerful tugs would tow these massive canvas and wood structures through the morning mist, creating a visible wake that looked, to a panicked scout pilot, like a carrier task force steaming at 15 knots. The deck crews on the real carriers nicknamed this operation the Hollywood Fleet. It felt absurd, almost insulting, to fight a war with lumber and paint while men were dying in the Coral Sea. But the commanders knew the truth. If the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto committed his strike planes to sinking a plywood barge, those planes wouldn't be over the real fleet. The stage was set, the props were in place, and now the U.S. Navy was about to pull back the curtain on the greatest piece of theater in naval history. If the plywood decoys were the body of the ghost fleet, the radio waves were its soul. The U.S. Navy knew that Japanese signals intelligence was elite. Their monitors sat in darkened rooms across the Pacific, listening to every crackle of static for the signature of an American task force. To sell the carrier that wasn't there, the Americans didn't just need a silhouette on the horizon, they needed a voice. The Americans assembled a specialized team of radio actors, signal corpsmen and board pilots with a flair for the dramatic. They were tucked away on a small, stationary communications ship hidden behind a tropical atoll, miles from any real combat. Their mission was to create a sonic footprint of a massive, aggressive carrier air wing. This was radio theater on a grand, lethal scale. The script was carefully written to be deliberately leaky. The actors used a low-grade, older encryption code that they knew the Japanese had already partially cracked. They spoke in a frantic, battle-ready shorthand, mimicking the chaotic chatter of a flight deck preparing for a massive launch. Blue lead to flight deck. We have a fouled wire on number 3. Clear the deck. We have 6 birds in the groove with low fuel. The pilots would shout into the headsets. To a Japanese listener, this wasn't just noise, it was intelligence. It painted a picture of a bustling flight deck, mechanical failures, and the high-tension environment of an active carrier. They heard the navigator, calling out coordinates that placed the Phantom fleet exactly where the plywood decoys were drifting in the mist. They heard squadron commanders, arguing over fuel loads, and ordnance officers, confirming the loading of 1,000-pound SAP, semi-armor-piercing, bombs. The brilliance was in the imperfection. If the radio chatter had been too clean, too organized, the IJN analysts might have smelled a rat. Instead, the Americans included mistakes, false starts, frustrated swearing, and overlapping voices. They made the carrier that wasn't there sound stressed. They wanted the Japanese to believe they had caught a vulnerable, disorganized American fleet in the middle of a complex rearming cycle. They even staged intercepted weather reports from the Phantom Fleet, confirming heavy swells and low ceiling at the decoy's coordinates. This gave the Japanese scouts a reason to trust their eyes when they eventually spotted the wooden silhouettes through the clouds. By the second day of the broadcast, the Japanese airwaves were buzzing with frantic activity. The IJN-Y service, Signals Intelligence, had taken the bait. They had triangulated the signals, matched them with the broken code fragments, and convinced Admiral Yamamoto's staff that a major U.S. task force was sitting, exposed, just north of the Solomon Islands. The actors on the radio ship could hear the shift in the Japanese transmissions. The tone of curiosity had turned into the sharp, rhythmic commands of a hunter who thinks he's found his prey. The plywood decoys provided the visual, and the radio actors provided the sound, but a carrier is only as real as the planes that fly from its deck. To the veteran Japanese observers, a carrier task force sitting in a lagoon without a visible air umbrella was a red flag. To cement the illusion of the carrier that wasn't there, the U.S. Navy needed to put steel in the sky. The flyover was a masterpiece of aeronautical choreography. The Americans utilized land-based squadrons, F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, stationed at secret, primitive jungle airstrips on nearby islands like Guadalcanal or Russell Island. These pilots were given a strange mission: don't look for the enemy. Look for the plywood. The tactic was simple but brilliant. The land-based planes would take off from their hidden dirt strips in the pre-dawn darkness. Once airborne, they would fly at low altitude, hugging the waves to stay under the horizon of Japanese coastal radar. They would then navigate to a specific point in the open ocean, right over the ghost fleet of barges and canvas. Once they reached the decoys, the squadrons would suddenly climb. To a Japanese scout or a submarine lookout watching through a periscope, it looked like a standard carrier launch. The planes appeared to rise directly from the deck of the plywood carrier, circling in tight, professional formations as they joined up for a strike. To a Japanese observer, the signature of a carrier-based squadron is unmistakable. They fly in specific patterns, they loiter at certain altitudes to conserve fuel, and they move with a different rhythm than land-based interceptors. The American pilots mimicked these behaviors perfectly. They would circle the ghost fleet for 20 minutes, then peel off and fly toward a fake target zone in the empty ocean, only to loop back and land at their secret jungle strips once they were out of visual range. The most convincing part of the theater was the recovery phase. In the late afternoon, the planes would return to the decoys. They would enter a standard carrier landing pattern, low, slow, and dirty, with their tail hooks extended and landing gear down. They would fly directly over the plywood deck at less than 50 feet, then suddenly break away and disappear into the evening mist or a convenient rain squall. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like they had just trapped onto the deck of a massive fleet carrier. The psychological impact on the Japanese scouts was profound. One Japanese roof floatplane pilot reportedly radioed back to Rabaul, confirmed. 1 Essex class, 2 cruisers. Air wing active. Launching now. He had seen exactly what the Americans wanted him to see. Not a pile of lumber and canvas, but a lethal, living nest of hornets. The stage was now fully dressed, the actors had performed their lines, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to commit its entire regional strength to attacking a ghost. The ghost fleet was no longer just a rumor on the airwaves, it was a confirmed sighting. When the reports from the roof scout planes and the triangulated radio intercepts reached the Japanese headquarters at Rabaul, the atmosphere shifted from caution to a frantic, predatory hunger. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, an American carrier task force caught in a localized weather system near the Solomons was the opportunity of the century. They didn't just want to shadow it, they wanted to annihilate it. The Japanese reaction was a chaotic, high-speed scattering of assets. Orders were flashed to cruiser divisions and destroyer squadrons to abandon their current patrol zones and converge on the Ghost Fleet's coordinates. The IJN High Command, convinced they had the Americans pinned down, committed their precious land-based Betty bombers and Zero fighters to a massive, coordinated strike. As the Japanese strike group scrambled, the panic became a logistical nightmare for them. They were chasing a phantom that moved only as fast as a tugboat, yet the radio theater made the carrier that wasn't there sound like it was steaming at flank speed. This discrepancy forced the Japanese pilots to fly longer, wider search patterns, burning through their limited fuel reserves in a desperate attempt to reacquire a target that seemed to vanish and reappear in the mist. Japanese reconnaissance pilots began reporting ghost sightings everywhere. In the high-tension environment of a naval hunt, a white cap on a wave became a wake. A dark cloud on the horizon became a plume of carrier smoke. The psychological pressure of the American radio theater had primed the Japanese brain to see what it feared. Every time a Japanese scout saw a shadow in a rain squall, they radioed back a new position, sending the IJN strike groups zigzagging across the Solomon Sea in a futile, exhausting pursuit. Meanwhile, the real U.S. Navy task forces were watching the chaos unfold from hundreds of miles away. Their radar screens showed the Japanese search patterns blooming like ink in water, moving away from the actual American targets and toward the Plywood decoys. The Japanese had been pulled off the ball. By committing their air cover to hunt a ghost, they had left their own bases and real troop convoys dangerously exposed. The panic reached a fever pitch when a Japanese submarine commander reported hearing the clatter of a busy flight deck through his hydrophones, a sound the Americans had cleverly simulated using underwater speakers and rhythmic metal-on-metal banging from a support boat. The IJN was now fully committed. They had turned their backs on the real war to fight a theater production made of canvas and static. The trap was not just set, it was being sprung. While the Imperial Japanese Navy was tilting at windmills in the Solomon Sea, the actual American strike force, the heavy hitters of the Pacific Fleet, was operating in a vacuum of silence. This was the dead zone, created by the decoy. Because the Japanese had committed their primary radar-equipped scout planes and their most aggressive fighter CAP, Combat Air Patrol, to hunting the carrier that wasn't there, the real target was left standing in the dark, completely unguarded. The real objective was a massive Japanese supply hub and airbase tucked behind a fortress of coral and anti-aircraft batteries. Ordinarily, an American approach would have been spotted 200 miles out, triggering a swarm of Zeros and a counterstrike by Betty bombers. But on this morning, the Japanese early warning system was looking the wrong way. Their eyes were fixed on the Plywood barges and the radio actors to the north. The American strike began at 0800. A massive wave of Helldivers and Avengers dropped out of the clouds, not over a Phantom, but over a packed Japanese harbor. The surprise was total. On the ground, Japanese crews were actually in the middle of refueling their own interceptors, preparing them to fly away to attack the Ghost Fleet. They were caught with fuel hoses out and bomb bays open. The first 500-pound bombs struck the fuel depots, sending pillars of black smoke into the air that could be seen for 50 miles. Because the Japanese fighter cover was 150 miles away chasing a radio signal, the American pilots had the luxury of making multiple passes. They picked apart the shipping in the harbor with surgical precision. Ammunition ships, intended to resupply the front lines, disintegrated in chain reaction explosions that rocked the very seabed. The radio chatter from the real attack began to hit the Japanese airwaves, creating a devastating cognitive dissonance in the IJN headquarters. For a frantic 30 minutes, the Japanese command received 2 sets of combat reports. One from their scouts claiming they were closing in on a carrier in the mist, and another from their own base commander screaming that they were being leveled by a massive, unopposed air raid. The confusion was the Americans' greatest ally. The Japanese Admiral, paralyzed by the conflicting data, hesitated. He didn't know which fleet was the real one. By the time he realized he had been chasing a theater production of plywood and static, his harbor was a graveyard of sunken hulls and burning hangars. The American real raid withdrew as quickly as it had arrived, disappearing back toward their actual carriers, which remained safely hidden behind a weather front. They had struck a blow that would have normally cost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of lives. Instead, they had done it for the price of some lumber, a few cans of gray paint, and a very convincing script. The Ghost had done its job. It had taken the punch so the real fleet didn't have to. The smoke from the real American raid had barely cleared before the Ghost Fleet performed its final act. It vanished. As the Japanese strike groups finally reached the coordinates of the reported carrier, they found nothing but empty, rolling swells and perhaps a few bobbing pieces of timber that looked suspiciously like theater props. The carrier that wasn't there hadn't been sunk. It had simply ceased to exist the moment the Americans turned off the radio transmitters and cut the tow lines. The psychological fallout within the Imperial Japanese Navy was more damaging than the lost fuel or the sunken supply ships. The realization that they had been outmaneuvered not by superior firepower, but by imagination, created a corrosive sense of paranoia. In the weeks that followed, Japanese scout pilots became hesitant. When they spotted a genuine American task force, they hesitated to report it as confirmed, fearing they were being lured into another plywood trap. This analysis paralysis gave the U.S. Navy a permanent, invisible advantage. The Hollywood fleet had proven a fundamental truth of naval warfare. The most important battlefield is the mind of the enemy commander. By feeding Admiral Yamamoto's staff exactly what they expected to see, a vulnerable carrier during a rearming cycle, the Americans exploited a confirmation bias. The Japanese wanted to find the carrier so badly that they ignored the small inconsistencies in the plywood grain or the looped radio chatter. Furthermore, this operation changed the economy of force. For the cost of a few Seabees, some cans of gray paint, and a handful of radio actors, the United States had neutralized an entire Japanese regional air wing for 48 hours. In military terms, the return on investment for the plywood decoys was astronomical. It allowed the real carriers to remain a fleet in being, a constant, unseen threat that the Japanese could no longer accurately track. Years later, declassified documents revealed that the radio theater had been so effective that Japanese intelligence had actually assigned a fictional name and hull number to the carrier that wasn't there. They had tracked its movement across the Pacific for months, attributing various phantom sightings to this ghost ship. The Americans hadn't just faked a battle, they had faked a legend. As the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, the lessons of the Ghost Fleet were integrated into the massive deceptions of D-Day and beyond. The carrier that wasn't there stands as a testament to the power of the unseen weapon. It reminds us that in the chaos of combat, a well-told lie can be just as lethal as a 1,000-pound bomb. The plywood has long since rotted away, and the radio waves have faded into the background radiation of the universe, but the victory won by theater remains one of the most brilliant chapters in the history of the Pacific War.